the deadliest catch. Among the only conditions of the ceasefire agreement, spelled out in concrete terms, was an extension of Gaza's fishing limit from 3 to 6 miles. In fact, this condition was outlined in the treaty that brought the November 2012 military escalation to an end, but it was never honored by Israel. For the fishing captains who remembered when it was possible to fish as far as 20 miles off the coast in the years before the 1993 Oslo Accords set into motion a gradually tightening regime of separation, another promised extension of the limit meant little. The best catches lay in the blue depths of the Mediterranean, but the Israeli naval cordon consistently sent Gaza fishing crews back to the port with miserable hauls before they even reached 6 miles at sea. Having been transformed by the siege into a literally captive market, Gazans are often forced to buy fish imported from Israel at inflated prices, even if it was caught just a few miles from their coastlines. Meanwhile, the 40,000 or so Gazans who depend directly on the fishing industry continue to sink into spiraling depths of poverty and despair. Less than a week after the ceasefire took effect, I arranged to join a local crew for one of the first overnight fishing voyages since the ceasefire. The trip would test the new limits and foreshadow the humanitarian landscape of the post-war era. If the status quo remained entrenched, it would not be difficult to predict another round of, quote, mowing the lawn at some point in the next 2 years, or the next operation would strike even deeper at the roots of Gaza's civilian population. When I arrived at the port with Dan Cohen in the late afternoon of September 1st, we passed the storehouses the fishing crews had used to hold their spare parts and the nets they would cast in the winter season when the different breeds of fish entered the sea. The single-story units had been reduced to rubble by Israeli missiles, their contents comprehensively torched. On a busy dock, as crews loaded their nets for the night's journey, a veteran member of Gaza's fishermen union named Zacharias Bakir told us that he and other boat owners had been worried Israeli naval cruisers and F-16s would bombard their boat, so they took a gamble and tucked everything away in storage units. Now, it was all gone. Zacharias estimated the losses at $1 million in destroyed equipment and $5 million in lost work for the entire port. He was a member of the famed Bakir clan that dominated the local fishing industry and which lost 4 of its young sons in one of the most widely publicized massacres of the war. After 7 years of siege and 3 devastating military assaults, this once prosperous family had been driven to the brink of ruin. We boarded a rickety diesel boat at sunset with Zacharias and rumbled out into the Mediterranean. At the middle of the boat was his cousin, Raid Bakr, who would be the captain for the night. Raid manned the wheel while his shipmate, with one hand, the other looked like it had been burned off, prepared wires and a navigation system with electrical tape and scissors. Other members of the crew sat cross-legged on the deck, sewing broken line. This next photo is a photo called Heading Out to Sea from Gaza City's port, and it is captured by Dan Cohen. Even as I struggled with the onset of seasickness as we bobbed in the sea like a cork, the experience of watching the concrete block buildings and traffic-choked streets of Gaza City faded into the distance was exhilarating. I watched the sun sink below the horizon, sending a fiery orange hue shimmering across the waves, and imagined sailing to a foreign port, perhaps to one of the Greek Isles, or maybe north to Beirut, and feasting on the fish that we had hauled along the way. I had to remind myself what Zacharias had told me when we were chatting on the dock. He had not been permitted to leave the Gaza Strip for a single day since he was arrested, and locked in an Israeli jail 41 years ago? As the night set in and the tiny lights of Gaza City dissolved to black, the first stage of the fishing operation began. Like every other boat that embarked from Gaza's port, this one was affixed with flood lamps that illuminated the sea around the boat, attracting schools of sardines to its immediate perimeter. Once we were 2 or 3 miles at sea, the ship came to a halt and the lights flashed on, turning the sea aqua blue. For almost an hour, we bobbed in the gentle sea while the crew patiently waited for the fish to gather. Some among the crew used the downtime to snare fish with single lines struck to plastic water bottles, while others smoked and hung out. At various intervals throughout the night, there were prayers at the bow and meals at the stern. Dan and I joined a few crew members around a rug for a modest meze dinner with Raid Bakr. Seated in a plastic chair, the captain proceeded to outline the perils of fishing under siege. Quote, "We are facing enormous problems," he explained. "We get kidnapped by the Israelis all the time." He pointed at a lanky member of his crew perched on the stern with an impassive gaze. "He was kidnapped," Raid said. "I was kidnapped. Many of these guys have been put in jail. When we got locked up, I got 1 year and he got 6 years," he added, motioning back to the crew member on the stern, silent and expressionless. Israeli naval patrol ships routinely encircled his boat at 80 kilometers an hour, Raid said, threatening to capsize it in the terrifying wake they created. On other occasions, the ships cut his nets and blew out his flood lamps with machine gun fire. The Israelis patrolled Gaza's coastline in the Shaldag-class fast patrol boats and Corvette-class cruisers provided to the military at a deeply discounted price by the German government. The boats had been used to shell civilian homes throughout the 51-day war, but now they had returned to the mundane duty of harassing Gaza's fishing crews. Quote, "Sometimes when they arrest me," Rel said, "they call me through the megaphone and give me orders. If you don't follow them, they can shoot at the boat. If they want to arrest someone on the boat, they make him strip naked, and whether or not the sea is quiet or stormy, they don't care. They make him jump in the water, and then he has to swim 800 meters to the Israeli boat." End quote. Would the presence of international reporters and activists on the boat shield him from the Israeli violence? I asked Raid. "If we encountered the Israeli Navy tonight," he explained, "they were less likely to attack the boat. However, if he tested the fishing limit with internationals on board, he could expect harsh repercussions the next day. According to Raid, each time he attempted to fish beyond the limit with internationals on board, the Israeli Navy would seek out his boat the following night and exact revenge with gunfire or by kidnapping members of his crew. To head off any future retribution by the Israelis, he planned to approach the naval cordon with extreme caution tonight. After an hour spent waiting for the catch to gather around the boat, it was time to run the nets. A crew member set out in a small mortarboat circling the boat and expanded the net into a basket that scooped up the sardines. Zacharias paddled behind him in a skiff, coordinating between the main fishing boat and the motorboat by shouting commands. Once the nets were out, the crew gathered at the starboard and began hauling them in by hand. Practiced during the pre-occupation days, when Gaza's fishermen navigated the sea in wooden sailboats, free from fear of Israeli harassment, this simple method had been passed down through the generations. As the crew hauled the nets back onto the ship, a flurry of little fish shot out onto the deck. Some hit me square in the face as I took video of the operation on my iPhone. It seemed to me that Raid and his crew had hauled in a sizable catch, but when the fish and the assorted sea creatures were finally packed away in plastic crates, the depressing reality sank in. Quote, "This catch should be triple what it was," Raid grumbled as he flicked his cigarette butt into the murky sea. Quote, "We lost so much money during the war when they bombed our storage spaces. I was sitting home for 50 days, praying to God for the chance to fish. I spent 50 days not knowing, plus the stress of being under the bombs the whole time. We fishermen, we live day by day. If we work today and get fish, I'll be able to live. I can go to the market and get vegetables for my family. If I don't get fish, I can't do anything. If I can't get past 4 miles at sea tonight, I won't get anything. End quote. The routine continued through the night. Flood lamps lit up the sea. The crew passed the time with cigarettes and small talk while the sardines gathered. The skiffs ran the nets. The crew yanked at the lines. The fish flopped across the deck. And at the end of it all, Raid was left grimacing about another miserable haul. At around 2 a.m., about half the crew had dozed off on mats and rugs laid out around the bow of the boat. Others sat along the boat's edges, sipping on coffee and heavily sugared tea. In spite of the imminent financial loss their trip would incur, the crew was unfailingly good-natured, treating their guests to coffee and sweets throughout the early hours of the morning. With the night nearly at its end, Zacharias was back in the skiff, guiding the net around the boat while the crew gathered at starboard to haul the lines back in for a final time. Instead of pushing the boat closer to the 6-mile limit, Ray seemed to be playing it safe. But even at just 4 miles at sea, he had run against Israel's iron wall. An Israeli patrol boat darted in from the distance, parked a few hundred meters west of our boat, and flashed a blinding spotlight on us. It was clear the crew was accustomed to these unpleasant encounters with the Navy as they continued their work undisturbed, muscling the nets in and packing the sardines with efficiency. Within 15 minutes, Riot had the boat chugging back to port. "We're all in prison here," Zacharias Bacher grumbled to me, "even when we're at sea." Back at the port, his crew loaded the plastic crates of sardines and prawns into the back of the rickshaws on their way to a nearby fish market. Ray had assessed the damage. The journey had cost him about 2,500 shekels, just over $600. But the haul would only garner 500 shekels, $125, at the market. I was out there for 14 hours, leaving my family behind while they pray that I can bring some kind of livelihood to them, Ray lamented. And now I have nothing. In fact, I have a huge loss, and I'm not alone. I have more than 100 people who depend on this boat. Entire families depend on this boat to bring them the basics for life. I asked Ray if the international community could do anything to help him. "Our message is simple," he responded. "We don't need any aid or anything. Just put pressure on the Israelis so they get out of the sea and let us fish and bring a livelihood to our families again." End quote. By October 2014, attacks on Gazan fishermen within the 6-mile fishing limit had become routine. The Palestinian Center for Human Rights documented 18 shooting incidents in the 2 months after the ceasefire, and at least 4 instances in which fishermen were arrested while working inside the 6-mile line. On October 22nd, the Israeli Navy chased 2 boats fishing off the coast in northern Gaza, peppering the crews with rubber-coated steel bullets and arresting 7 of them. Not a single rocket was fired into Israel from Gaza in these 2 months. Amidst the one-way ceasefire, the New York Times described the atmosphere as a, quote, "fragile calm." As the suffocating monotony of the siege returned to Gaza, diplomats gathered again in Cairo on October 12th, this time to consider raising the funds necessary to rebuild the Strip's shattered infrastructure, and to mull the possibility of replacing its pulverized factories with sweatshops. That was chapter 16. We're going to shut this off, turn right back on.